All right, let's dive into a world that's pretty much vanished. We're going back to 19th century Slovakia, to the Kysuce region, to explore its rugged, incredibly dangerous, and totally vital timber industry. It's a story of amazing skill, high-stakes business, and a way of life that was completely ruled by the raw power of nature.
So let me start with the puzzle for you. Imagine you need to get thousands of giant logs from some remote mountain forest to cities that are hundreds of kilometers away. But there are no highways, no railways. How in the world do you do it?
Well, the answer was the river. But these were not the calm, wide rivers you're probably picturing. The rivers in Kysuce were shallow, they were rocky, and they were just wild. They could go from a trickle to a raging torrent in just a few hours. So this wasn't just transportation, this was a straight-up battle against the elements.
To really understand this unbelievable journey, we have to start where the trees did, deep in those huge fir and beech forests that pretty much covered the entire Kysuce landscape back then.
So first off, who actually owned all this wood? You see, back in the early 1800s, the forests didn't belong to the people working in them. Nope, they were the property of feudal lords. For a lot of the local people, logging wasn't a job you applied for, it was a feudal duty. It was basically a tax you paid with sweat and really, really hard labor. And watching over all of it was this strict hierarchy of officials. You had the chief foresters, the oberjagri, all the way down to the local rangers, the valjagri, who managed their own little territories.
And the process itself was just meticulous, backbreaking work. It all kicked off when a waldhager went out and marked the specific trees to be cut. Then teams of loggers would come in with nothing but hand axes and these huge two-handed saws. As soon as a tree was down, they'd strip the bark right there on the spot, which was super important, by the way. It helped prevent rot and made the logs slide way easier. And finally, the massive job of hauling began, with horses dragging these giant logs to the edge of the river, where the next, even crazier stage of their journey was about to begin.
Okay, so once those logs got to the riverbank, the most dangerous part of the whole journey kicked off. This is where the real adrenaline hits, because they weren't just floating logs downstream. They were basically surfing on a controlled explosion of water.
And what made this wild ride even possible was the poploft, or the half-raft. This thing was a piece of pure engineering genius, born out of total necessity. Just look at the design. The logs were bound super tight at the front, which gave them a solid point to steer from. But in the back, they were only loosely connected, and this allowed the whole raft to bend and flex, kind of like a snake, so it could slither through those incredibly shallow and rocky Kysuce rivers without getting smashed into a million pieces. This meant rafting here was nothing like what you might be thinking. I mean, on the main Váh River, rafting was pretty predictable. You had these big, rigid rafts just floating on a constant current. But in Kysuce, it was the total opposite, chaotic, dangerous, and it all depended on flash floods. The Slovak word for it was narazovite, which literally means shock-like, and that's exactly what it felt like.
You see, they couldn't just schedule a departure. The whole industry just waited for rain, a lot of rain. And when the skies finally opened up and the rivers turned into these raging torrents, it was go time. Instantly, no hesitation, you had to launch your raft right then and there to catch that violent surge of water. It was this tiny window of opportunity that could slam shut just as quickly as it opened. It took unbelievable courage and just a deep, deep understanding of the river.
But you know, the dangers weren't just in the water. The business side of this whole industry was just as treacherous. It was a world of handshake deals, broken promises, and some pretty clever scams.
And you might be asking, how do we know so much about these deals? Well, it's because they went wrong, a lot. A huge chunk of what we know today comes from old court records, where rafters and merchants were constantly suing each other over lost goods, fraudulent claims, and broken contracts. These documents paint this incredibly vivid picture of a really high-stakes game.
So let's look at one case from 1840. A merchant ordered a delivery of timber. The records show that his agents in a town called Chatska received and signed for exactly 42 rafts. Seems pretty straightforward, right?
Well, not so fast. The seller then goes to the agents with this whole sob story. He claimed his rafters lost some of the individual receipts during the chaotic trip. He's pleading with them, saying something like, "Look, I know I sent 43 rafts. Please, just give me one single receipt for 43 and we'll figure it out later." And the agents, maybe they were just trying to be helpful, they actually agreed.
And that was the trap. With that new fake receipt in his hand, the seller went right back to the buyer and demanded payment not for 42 rafts, but for 43. He was trying to get paid for a ghost raft, a raft of timber that never even existed. It's a perfect example of why you had to be so vigilant in a business built on trust and little slips of paper. And this kind of thing was incredibly common. The court records are just filled with these stories. You had sellers who promised rafts during the crucial spring floods but then didn't deliver until winter, leaving all the timber just frozen solid in the river. You had dishonest merchants downriver who'd agree to one price and then pay a much lower one because they knew the rafter was too far from home to do anything about it. And of course, you just had plain old theft at the crowded depots, where one team of loggers would steal marked timber from another. It was a true Wild West of commerce.
But this entire way of life, something that had defined the region for centuries, was about to come to a very sudden and very permanent end.
It wasn't just one thing, it was more like a rapid-fire succession of blows. First, in the 1870s, the railway arrived, and all of a sudden there was a way to move timber that didn't care about the weather. It was faster, safer, way more reliable. Then came new laws that made rafters personally on the hook financially for any damage their rafts caused to new bridges or dams, a risk that most just couldn't afford to take. And the final nail in the coffin? The construction of massive hydroelectric dams on the Váh River after 1918. They physically blocked the ancient water highway, turning a flowing river into a chain of lakes. The era of the long-distance rafter was officially over.
And look, the railway and the dams, that was progress, no question. They brought modernity and new opportunities. But it makes you think, what was lost in that shift? An entire craft, passed down through generations. This unique set of skills, an intimate knowledge of the forest and the river, and just a world of incredible human resilience, all of it just washed away by the currents of change. And that leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to think about in our own time.